Okay, so back to this. So umikol mokom omar. So even though I've already said that it's better for us to remain silent on this matter, I will say at least this: Kiguf inyan dina de malchusa lahatil mas al kol amo lahamid mehem anoshim litzva milchamto. He says, because first of all, he says this is a matter of dina de malchusa, that you have to obey the law of the land, and it is within the purview of a king to tax his people not only financially, but also to tax them, to require them to deliver a certain percentage of the young male population to the draft in order to be conscripted into the army. V'zehu michok malchuso v'dino din. And it was within the king's purview, it's within his right to do this, and that becomes the halacha, that's the law. Umimela mutal akarkafta dechol mi shiroi lotzes v'shein lo isha ubanim kefi nimus v'chok malchuso. And therefore, anyone who has the ability to go to war and does not have a wife or children, I guess in some countries they made that as the criteria, that if you're single and you don't have a wife and kids, so then you become eligible for the draft. Achlo abachurim lomdei Torah. He says the only exemption is that if you have yeshiva bachurim, he says if they are engaged in Talmud Torah, and that's what they're doing with their lives, so then the king does not have a right, even using the principle of Dina de Malchusa, to conscript these young men. Shafilu lo patrum hamalchus beferish mikol makom midin Torah piturim. Because even if the government does not exempt them explicitly, they are still exempt from going out from being conscripted to the army by Torah law. And this is the claim the Chassam Sofer makes. The Gemara in Bava Basra makes a statement, and it says that everyone is subject to being drafted to dig ditches for the community works, and even rabbinical students. He says, but that's only if they're taxing the people so that they can hire workers. But their Talmidei Chachamim have to participate. But if they're not taxing people and they're rather expecting people to go out and dig ditches themselves in groups, Talmidei Chachamim are exempt from that labor. So that's the Gemara's contention. I don't know where there's a pasuk. It doesn't really say where there's a pasuk in this, but the Chassam Sofer believes that this is a biblical law, or at least it's either a tradition. It's not really clear, but he says based on that Gemara, you cannot draft Talmidei Chacham, and it could very well be that it was on that basis that when the state of Israel was founded, Ben Gurion was influenced, and they basically, the whole religious community cited this issue that you can't draft the Torah scholars. Uma kol shekain hamalchus. I'm not sure. Hamalchus. This is an abbreviation for some government that the Chassam Sofer is familiar with, whether it's Russia or Hungary, it's not clear. Patrum. He says when the government itself exempts young students for religious reasons, where they've already created an exemption, then certainly they are exempt. Uchvar kama pa'amim keshenasati atest livnei medinos pihem umeharin shehem lomdim v'yatzlichu linhog tzibur niftaru milahamid atzim latzava. So he says, I personally, says the Chassam Sofer, have given several attestations for different members of the Jewish community who are learning in yeshiva, and they've been exempted because they are being groomed to be communal leaders. And apparently the government at the time, at least the government in question, recognize this idea that if a young man is going through an educational process where he's being groomed to become a community leader, a religious leader, maybe like if a young man goes to study in a what's the word I'm looking for, in a monastery, right? And he's being trained to become a priest. There was probably some exemption, so they probably had to extend that to Jews as well. Okay, v'im kain kol hanogeya bohem nogeya b'bavasayin. And therefore, anyone who in any way tries to get yeshiva bachrim to be conscripted into the army is actually poking God in the eye. That's a phrase that we find in Tehillim. So v'idach haya meharoi sheyamdu atzmim kulam b'shava lifnei ha'eda. On the other hand, if a shtetl is faced with community is faced with an order of conscription, it might be proper to line up all the eligible young men in front of the community, v'yatiru gorol, and let them do a lottery. Ve'almi sheyipol alav hagorol, hu yishtadel le'atzmo b'meshi yachol liftor b'mamon, and then whoever sort of loses the lottery, in other words, whoever's name comes up and is chosen from among the community to be one of the conscripts, so he can, on his own, try to make any effort with the government. Once his name is put forward, then he can try to buy his way out, or to try and get someone else to replace him. In other words, try and persuade someone else to take his place. Or he would be permitted to allow himself to be conscripted, depending upon the circumstance. V'chol Yisrael mechuyavim l'sayo v'yekar pijon nafsho. He says, and everyone has to try and help this fellow. I mean, let's say the guy goes around, he's collecting tzedakah to try and collect enough money to be able to pay for not having to go to the army. He says, yes, I encourage other Jews to try and help him. Avol le'enos anoshim beligoro, v'lomar she'im pochasim v'reikim afilu megali arayos u'mechalolei Shabbos. He says, but here's what I do frown upon, says the Chasam Sofer. He says there was apparently a practice that the bums of the boys who were the bums, the ones who were not that frum, and they were, wasting their time, and they were not Shomer Shabbos, and they were dating lots of girls, and carousing and having wild lifestyles. Back in the day, I don't know what that exactly meant, but the point is that they were not the ones that the community was proud of. So basically, they would, without even taking a lottery, the community leaders basically said, "Oh, let's give him Yankel, because Yankel is a ne'er-do-well, and we have no use for him in the community." He says, "Be'enai hu kagonev nefesh u'mecharo." He says that's in my eyes a violation of one of the 10 commandments of lo tiknovu. You're not allowed to kidnap, because basically what they're doing is that they're not being fair. They're not using any kind of lottery or democratic process, and they're basically saying because he's a schlepper, or because he's not with the program, we can just discard him and get rid of him. Kimi no things ze khalife ze kaven shechiv hamalchus ufkudaso al kulam b'shava. What right does anyone in the community have to make that kind of decision to say that he goes instead of somebody else? He says because the burden is really placed on the entire community. V'hamosro kemoser l'to michmar afilu machmi ativna chayev makol shekein moser nafsho. So he says this is like being a moiser, and he gives an illustration from the Gemara that we're not going to go into, where you show the government where someone's assets are hidden, but certainly to implicate someone to the government and basically say, "Oh, he's the guy that you want." V'ra umar yoter. He says that's even worse. Ki hatovim hane'enosim ovrim al hamitzvos ba'ones uleitim rechokim. He says, and let me put it to you this way. He says, if you have frum young men who are going to be conscripted, they will do whatever is in their power to limit the number of mitzvahs that they have to violate because they're in the army, they're in the Russian army. He says, but if you force this guy to go, he's going to violate many, many more mitzvahs because he won't be paying attention to try and minimize the amount of mitzvahs that he's going to be violating. Ve'elu yasu baratzon, va'anu madchim achar hanofel, ayin perakama de kiddushin linyan machar atzmal lenachri. We always try to look out for the person who has fallen. And therefore, and this is an important principle that the Chassam Sofer lays down, and that is just because a guy may not be so frum doesn't mean that you can feed him to the sharks, because looking at it another way, a guy who's a frum kid, he at least will try his best to observe the Torah in any way possible. He'll avoid eating the tray for food whenever he can, that the army gives him. Whereas the fellow who's not so frum is not going to be trying that. He says, and then the final paragraph, he says, Achmashin imtsoyim ata lemeos hamochrim atzma miritzano uveritzi kesef. He says, today we have a phenomenon. He says, this is again in the middle 19th century. He says that there are a bunch of young men who actually sell themselves. In other words, they will take from the highest bidder, or they'll put a price on their head, I guess, to say that if the community gives me X amount of dollars, I'll voluntarily go. I'll be one of the people, and so you won't have to sacrifice your own children. He says, in that situation, even though we know that they're going to violate the Torah deliberately once they get conscripted, because they don't really care about religion. He says, but you're not forcing them to do that in that situation. They're voluntarily going, but they're just offering to do it for your shtetl to save your own children. And as long as you give them a certain dollar amount that is collected from the rest of the community. And if this shtetl doesn't want to come up with the cash, he'll just go to another shtetl and sell himself there. And so based on that, the Chassam Sofer feels that it's acceptable for a guy who offers to take money in order to allow himself to be conscripted. It's okay for the rest of the community. Let's say I don't want my son to go to the army, so I'll cough up, a certain amount of money to pay this guy so that he takes the place. He takes my son's place. In Kain kal kalasam kal kalasam ba'avonosenu harabim takana ktsas. And therefore, the fact that he's willing to go is a remedy to some degree. V'chein asu b'chol galilotenu. And this is the way we have conducted ourselves in our community, it says, and it's almost like choosing the lesser of two evils. He says, I have been very brief in my comments here, and it is not worthwhile to say any more. As one can appreciate. Hashem hatov yitin kol tuv kenafsho hatahora. He says, and may God grant everything pure according to one's pure soul. Okay, so this, he writes this Taf Kuf Tzadi. Taf Kuf Tzadi is, let's see, that's 5590, so 5590. It's almost 200 years ago, I would say. It's a little bit shy of 200 years ago. It's 190, like 190 years ago, or 180 something years ago, 190 years ago. Anyway, so so the so the bottom line is that there are times when we will allow young men to volunteer to go, provided that they go of their own free will. But it would be usher, he says, to give up certain young men, even if our criteria is based on the fact that they're the bums of our community. We don't have a right to do such a thing. And also what we saw here is that you don't have a right to give up the Talmidei Chachamim, to allow them to be conscripted into war, into the army. This doesn't really have any real life applications today, but I just thought it was a point of interest because historically, it might be why this whole system in Israel was set up to exempt young men who want to study in yeshiva from going out to war. And the Chassam Sofer feels very strongly that that exemption still, is a very valid exemption. Of course, it may be subject to some level of abuse, in today's world, where there may be some boys who are not fit. They're not cut out for yeshiva, and they exempt themselves nonetheless. And especially the argument can be made that in the Israeli army, it's not like the Russian army. You get drafted, and they provide you with the complete ability to study Torah while you're in the army and to observe halacha while you're in the army, to whatever extent possible, except in times of war. And we have so many religious young men who do go to the army in Israel. So it's unclear what the Chassam Sofer would say to a modern Israeli army today. But it all relates to this halacha that we're learning, which is the obligation to not the obligation to not save yourself at the expense of other people is essentially what this is in the context of. Okay,
Rabbi, and also isn't the case in the Israeli army a little different than here? Because here you're fighting for a country which is a non, secular, non-Jewish country, maybe fighting wars that are not necessarily that you believe in. Where in Israel, you're protecting the land, you're protecting the country. You're fighting alongside from companions or whatever. So it's a different scenario. I don't know if they're comparing apples with apples here.
Well, you're right, Ron. It is a different scenario, but I don't know that a person necessarily has the right to exempt himself because he's fighting for a foreign army. If you live in a country, you have an obligation, just like everyone else who lives in that country, to defend that country. So if I'm a Canadian, if it's for Canadians, it's not so pertinent. I don't think Canada has gone to war for quite some time. When was the last Canadian war?
Probably the Civil War.
Second World War.
Right, but I guess that's true. I guess Canadians did participate in the Second World War. That's actually true. If Canada did Canada have a draft in the Second World War?
I don't know.
I don't think we've ever had a compulsory draft.
Right. But if a country has a draft because they feel that their country is in danger, then it is an obligation for everyone to participate. The water becomes murky when you get involved in a Vietnam kind of war or Korea kind of war, where the war is being fought well away from the shores, and the country itself is not in danger, but is trying to help another country. So that, I agree, is very controversial, which is why, so much has been discussed about those two wars, the Korean and the Vietnamese and the Vietnam War. But I don't know that you can necessarily say that a Jewish person has the ability to exempt himself from going out to being conscripted to an army simply because it's not Israel. Any country that I live in the diaspora, I have a patriotic, nationalistic duty to support that country at least as much as any citizen of that country. Okay.
So according to my prime source for information, Wikipedia. It says conscription was implemented in Canada during the First and Second World War for men of military age and fitness. So I guess we did have conscription in First and Second World War. I have a question that's kind of tangential a little bit, and with apologies to Joby. Is there something about physicians, and we wouldn't necessarily say we would send secular Jews as opposed to observant Jews, because observant Jews know what to do and how to keep the halacha in situations of what they can and can't do, as opposed to secular Jews who don't care. Am I right about that? And is that at all similar to what we've been saying?
Well, that was an argument that some Sofer gave, to say that we're going to give up the non-observant Jews just because they don't care about halacha is not a good argument.
Right. So I'm just thinking about a modern day application for doctors on Shabbos.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so for doctors working on Shabbos, you're right. Right. There is such a halacha that's discussed by the poskim. It's a very, very good point. If I'm part of a practice where all the doctors in my practice are Jewish, and there's rotations, so if I refuse to take Shabbos, then another Jewish doctor will take it. What is my level of obligation? Am I allowed to do such a thing? And I think that, in general, anytime you're part of, first of all, I don't know if that applies in today's world of socialized medicine, where you're working for a healthcare system. I don't know how partnerships are set up in Canada today, but it's becoming less and less relevant in the US also. But in a traditional partnership where it's a private entity and it's a company, right? And whether it's a medical practice, it could also be a legal practice, it could be any other kind of company where there are different members of the company, so such that if I take off Shabbos, it's going to obligate someone else to work on Shabbos. It's always lechatchila preferred that there be at least one non-Jew who can pick up the slack for the Shabbos and Yontif, right? You certainly don't want to join a practice where you're going to be lechatchila, where you're going to be one Jew of a partnership where everyone else is Jewish. So your refusal to work on Shabbos will require others to work on Shabbos. However, let's say the practice is already existent and it's all Jewish and they want to hire you. This to me would strike me as a case of where it's before the water has come to hit to your property, where you basically say, if you'd like to hire me because of my talent or because of my specialty, then I'm only willing to work under the condition that I can have off every Shabbos and Yontif. Now, this may require them to divide the rotation on Shabbos among the other Jewish partners, but the fact of the matter is that they were already doing that before you joined. You're just basically saying, I'm okay to join your group as long as I don't have to work on Shabbos and Yontif. But if let's say a guy was part of such a practice and then he becomes a Baal Tshuva, and he says, I'm no longer working on Shabbos and Yontif and it's going to fall on you guys, then it becomes much more problematic. I would agree with you, Paul, and it's a very good application of this halacha.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I think we'll hold it here for today. And we'll pick it up in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, unless Joby wanted to reply. Okay. All right.
Could I just ask a quick question? Do you know of another opinion on this? Because you're in a situation where this is, an ongoing argument in Israel about, whether religious people have to go to the army. And you're right, it's being abused, but is this like one of these cold, fast rules that this is just the way it is? Or there's always seems to be other opinions?
Well, as I mentioned, yeah, a Talmid Chacham can exempt himself from being conscripted to the army, but that's again, it's all provided what kind of army service is being placed upon him, and also what is the nature of the, there are many desk jobs that Torah scholars can engage in. The Gemara just said that you can't force them to dig ditches, but what about forcing them to engage in practices where they can maintain their Torah scholarship and at the same time help their country?
Right. Maybe like national service or something.
Yeah, national service. That's been argued for years. There's plenty of gray area. I don't want anyone to infer from here, any kind of policy decision that should or should not be made for the Israeli government. I just wanted to provide you with food for thought.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, all
Very
right.
interesting.